See over all the streets the fascist banner waving, triumphant standard of a race reborn.
It was Irish sweat and labour here, where we're standing, that made the docks, the London docks. Irish sweat and labour. And north, just north of the Irish, towards the Whitechapel section, was the Jewish section. Both of them were dedicated to the defence of this area, which was to be invaded by a fascist army under Oswald Mosley on October the 4th, 1936.
In Stepney, thousands of Eastenders prepare to resist the invasion, barricading the path the fascists will take. 6,000 police are already concentrated in the area.
I think there are two important things to say about the Battle of Cable Street, and some of them are misunderstood. The first one is that it's assumed to be a battle between Oswald Mosley's fascists and the people of East London. But in fact, the battle was three-way, between the fascists, the police and the people of East London.
Mounted police come to colleagues' help. Batons are drawn and heads broken as the anti-fascist demonstrators resist efforts to disperse them.
The real problem was the arbitrary authority of the police, the state and property. And most people, and particularly the political activists, understood the real dynamic of that. And I think this is a salutary story in relationship to this. Up towards Whitechapel, there was an area of very, very cheap rented accommodation. But it wasn't cheap enough for most of the people in the area, and many times they were evicted because they couldn't afford the rent. And there was a particular movement among radicals in the 30s, and this actually went through to the 50s, of defending people from eviction against their landlords. And on one occasion, in fact on many occasions, but this is one documented and in public record, that local activists organised around the Stepney branch of the Communist Party went to defend a fascist sympathiser against an eviction. And you say, why would they do that? But the local working class activists said, look, this is something we will deal with. We will deal with their politics. We will deal with an argument with them about what they think about their fellow population and community. You will not get rid of them. That's our job. We'll decide. And so on a particular occasion, when the bailiffs came to evict these fascist sympathisers, then a group of local activists said no, and they stopped that eviction. So when I say that the three-way struggle was between the police, the activists and the fascists, I'm not minimising the opposition to the fascists. I'm merely saying that the primary conflict was between local working class activity and the state. And I think that's something that we should bear in mind about the time, which we've lost. And the second, and I think equally important element of what happened on that day, which is perhaps difficult to grasp nowadays, is that it was about an East End which was very alien to most people's experience. East London is now assimilated into our culture through EastEnders and chirpy cockneys. But in 1936 it was a very dangerous place, or at least in people's imaginations, and it was a place where people fought hard about politics, about life, about many things. And the great thing about the Battle of Cable Street is that the people of the East End, those other people, came together and did something which perhaps we can't really understand, which was to act together to defeat somebody politically. They didn't rest on their laurels. They didn't say, we're happy with who we are. They didn't say, this is our cultural identity, leave me alone. They said, we're going to stop this, we're going to change something, we're going to act.
Communists, Labourites and Jews jammed the fascist route, resisting the peaceful efforts of the outnumbered police to clear the way. Incensed by black-shirt, anti-red, anti-Jew propaganda, 5 East End boroughs unsuccessfully petitioned the Home Office to forbid the march. Now the crowd take matters into their own hands.
And I think that's very important. The context for this was that Oswald Mosley formed a party called the British Union of Fascists in 1932. By 1936 he was having a hard time. He wasn't doing as well as he thought he was going to do. So Mosley had hit a roadblock. He was making no progress. He decided that one way of breaking through electorally was to galvanise anti-foreign sentiment, anti-Jewish sentiment, anything against the other. And the place to do that was the East End of London, which was brought everybody together. The East End of London was always the melting pot of British society, and he could specifically target the Jewish population of the East End of London. So he decided, after a campaign of about 9 months in which he was using his thugs to intimidate people, to smash windows, to come down here and say, we can do this, look, we are going to take on the foreigner in British society. What happened?
Passing the Tower of London, 5,000 fascists rally to their mobilisation for the much advertised march through the East End. And Sir Oswald Mosley, black-shirt leader, arrives at Royal Mint Street to inspect his followers.
I remember it distinctly. I was a young lad, 15 and a half, attached to the Labour League of Youth, conglomeration of young men between 16 and 20, dedicated to the overthrow of fascism, not only in England but abroad. I took a tram down to Mile End, got off the tram, and there was a massive crowd congregated in that area within about a few hundred yards of where Mosley was going to advance. And you could hear in this conglomeration of people the chants, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we want Mosley, dead or alive. And all across there was these banners flying. Remember them as though it were yesterday. I pushed my way through these banners. People were there, I can see them now, young and old, but mainly local people consisting of Irish and Jewish working class. They'd come there to stop the fascist invasion of our patch.
It brought people together. It brought very diverse communities together. It brought them together as people who opposed fascist violence, not on the basis of ethnicity, but on the basis of politics. And I think that's an important point to remember in the contemporary discussion. They brought people together politically, not culturally. People continued to have different cultures, but they had a political allegiance to stopping Mosley marching. Even more important, it showed the configuration of what the politics were in the East End of London. The Labour Party decided that it didn't want anything to do with the mobilisation against the fascists. It would be too difficult, it would be too problematic, it would be too violent. But this also applies to the question of religion. The Jewish Board of Deputies said, do not go out on the streets. If you go out on the streets, you will be castigated as violent Jews. So religious sentiment and conventional political sentiment were aligned. They both said, don't take on Mosley. What else? Well, there were a number of groups who wanted to do things. The most important was the local Communist Party. The Communist Party was cross-ethnicity. It grouped together the Jewish population of Stepney with certain elements of the old Irish population of Wapping. And that's the most important thing. There was a political alignment around an idea of changing something. Now, we then have a problem, because Mosley was going to march on the 4th of October, a Sunday. The Communist Party decided that it didn't want to take on the establishment. It wanted to stay close to the Labour Party because it had a new project of a popular front. It had been so frightened by the growth of fascism in Europe, it had been so frightened by its own defeats against that movement, that it cozied up to the Labour Party and said, OK, we don't want to go. What we'll do is we'll organise a demonstration in Trafalgar Square on the same day, and it will be a good demonstration because it will be in support of our brothers and sisters in Spain who are fighting a war. Very good idea. But as people commented at the time, the best way of taking on the fascists was not by celebrating in Trafalgar Square about Spain, important though that was, but by doing something real in the East End of London on Sunday the 4th of October 1936. And so the Communist Party in London, the District Committee in London, came under incredible pressure from the Stepney Party. The Stepney Party said, look, we need to do this in principle, but we also need to do this pragmatically, because if you don't do it, somebody else will, because people want to do this. It took ages, right up until the Friday before the Sunday, the Communist Party was still committed to that demonstration in Trafalgar Square. It was only under the most intense local pressure and finally dawning on them that this would be a total disaster if they ignored it, that they changed their position. Very late. Fortunately, the local party, members of the Independent Labour Party, other activists, including anarchists, ordinary people, were on the ground organising. And so within 48 hours, they were able to put together a huge organisation which was then able to take on the events of Sunday, the 4th of October. And that's where the story becomes a very practical one in terms of what happened on the day.
I got to where the first battle took place. It wasn't a battle, it was a defensive action against the fascists, and that was at Lemon Street, which is just round the corner here. And there, I remember leaning against the wall and seeing a massive army all around me. They said it was over 200,000 people congested in that one main road.
The British Union of Fascist Mobilisation was scheduled for 2:30 p.m. They were due to assemble in Royal Mint Street, which was to enter the East End towards Whitechapel around Gardener's Corner. Most people report that after a few hours in the morning, it was very difficult to even get out of the underground stations around Aldgate, because most of the preparation had been done by the local people and by the Communist Party and the local Communist Party and the Independent Labour Party much earlier in the morning. And one thing I'd really like to draw attention to, and this applies to the question of violence and the question of the number of people who were injured, 80-odd people were injured, 80-odd people were arrested, 80-odd people were injured according to the local statistics. Now the reason it doesn't appear to be that much, and I'm not celebrating the violence here, is because the local organisers had their own first aid stations. They didn't go to the hospitals. They had everything organised. They had all their preparation. It was self-organisation of the highest kind. And they knew exactly what to do to stop everybody moving. But to do that, they needed the total support of the local population. Because if the fascists had been able to outflank them by coming in through Wapping, through the Irish Docklands areas, then they would have been comprehensively defeated. It was that unity between the two different populations, because they didn't exist as separate populations, which made it possible to hold the fascists out of the East End. And even more important perhaps, the fascists couldn't come in through Bethnal Green. Everybody assumes that that was a fascist stronghold, but even that was contested territory. So they had to come in through the city, and they had to come in with police support. And that's the next stage of the battle as it presented itself.
It was just after about 2 o'clock when we expected Mosley to march. There came the marching feet of police, and in front of them, a group of horses, police on horseback. They were to be the four leaders of the fascist march. Got as far as this crossroads when a tram came across right in front of them. The driver got off and left the tram. A natural barricade which stopped the police getting into the forefront of our defence. Kids were throwing marbles at the horses and they were collapsing on the floor. The police worked themselves into a frenzy, but they were stopped by this barricade of a tram. We learnt later that the man who was the driver was a member of the Communist Party, local Communist Party. There were women throwing filth and dirt and emptying garbage onto the police. And I was standing only 150 to 200 yards away from here. And they actually captured 2 of the policemen at the time. They took them round here, actually. And later on, when I did research, I found out the family that kept their helmets after they released the policemen. Police were there, Mosley well behind him. You couldn't see Mosley, it was all coppers. It was really a police war against the local people.
And they baton charged on at least 3 occasions into the first ranks of the local population. What stopped what was going on in this area of London was a willingness to challenge not just something you disliked, but the authority of the state. And that was a combination of political activism, a set of ideas held by real people in real circumstances, and a weight of numbers, quality and quantity. Now, what happened was that this worked. Over 3 or 4 hours, the police tried to break down, they tried to break through the lines, they arrested people, they beat people with batons, the people who were beaten were replaced, and in the end, it looked as though it was impossible to get through.
Well, it was about 4 or 4:30, I think, that I could see that there was a stalemate. The police couldn't get through. And what was, to me, most, I think, uplifting was to see bearded Jews and Irish Catholic dockers side by side behind barricades up here at the end of Cable Street, which stopped the police getting through.
And then 2 things happened. Mosley, dilettante that he was, turned up late. He was on his way to a wedding in Germany, his own wedding, presided over by Joseph Goebbels, and he decided that things weren't going to plan. Local Labour dignitaries decided that things were getting too fraught and negotiated with the commissioner of the police, somebody called Commissioner Games, and they decided to point the fascists in the other direction. So instead of trying to get into the East End, they marched away along the embankment. And so, in practical terms, the day was a victory. But the important thing to remember is what happened later. And I think some of the most important people involved in this made this point, particularly a guy called Joe Jacobs, who was the secretary of the Stepney District Party of the Communist Party, later expelled for his street activism by the party. And he made the following point, is that what made it possible to win this one-day victory, not a total victory, was the unity of different sections of the working class. And that's good. But what we should also recognise is that most of the labour movement, for most of the time, was trying to ban the fascist march rather than dealing with it themselves. And they insisted that the problem was just as much the opposition to the fascist march as the fascist march. Almost within days, the Labour Party at its autumn conference condemned the opposition to the fascist march, a motion moved by Herbert Morrison, later head of the late London County Council, and I think a relative of Peter Mandelson. And he made this point that the communists were just as much to blame as the fascists in this instance. And within weeks or months, the national government had introduced the Public Order Act, ostensibly against uniformed manifestations of political belief, but almost immediately that limitation on public democracy was used much more against working class activism than it ever was against the fascists. And right through into the 70s and 80s, it was used against people who opposed British rule in whatever part of the world, particularly the Irish struggle. And it's the thin end of the wedge as we now contemplate our own struggle to increase civil liberties or to maintain civil liberties in opposition to British involvement in various parts of the world. We cannot now demonstrate within the confines of Parliament. What would that mean to somebody who defended the East End of London against the fascists and against police support for that march? We have to recognise that our own defence of civil liberties can never, never be put in the hands of an authority other than our own power.
Before October the 4th, if you look Jewish in a street, you could be set upon by a group of black-shirted warriors, Mosley's army, and all across, painted on the walls, perish Judea, HRP, down with the Jews, perish the Jews. And also in the little steebles, or where the Jews had their little synagogues, I and a friend of mine, Sullivan, an Irish, on 2 occasions we had to stand outside because when they came out on a Friday night after the service, fascists would be waiting at the corner to attack old people and beat them up. And we had a sort of defence army. We had to have a defence army to see that wasn't done. And one Saturday we went over to Victoria Park to watch the football. They had Saturday football there as boys. And I remember I was with a McCarthy who was a trainee boxer. And we were walking through Meath Gardens, which is external to Victoria Park, when suddenly a group of young fascists, obviously in black shirts, in their uniform, shouted, "Jew bastards, get out." Now McCarthy wasn't a Jew bastard, he was the son of an Irish Catholic. He told us stop, he walked back to the leader, boom, straight in the face, broke his nose, you see the blood spurting out, and the rest turned and fled.
Cable Street took place in the context of a very, very fraught international environment. At that time, fascism was on the rise throughout Europe. But at the same time, Britain, or the British establishment, realised that they would have to take on Germany again. For them, it didn't really matter that Germany was fascist. What really mattered was they were having to take on a reinvigorated Germany. But for many ordinary people in Britain, they would never have fought for king and country, but they would fight against a fascist Germany or a fascist Europe. And one of the things we should remember about Cable Street, particularly in relationship to the official Labour movement, was that it was a way of reconciling ordinary British people to fight for Britain against something they hated even more. They weren't too fond of Britain, they weren't too fond of the British Empire, but they thought fascism was even worse. And that's something that's often been forgotten in the period since 1936. Before we get to that point, though, we should realise that it was very dangerous for a lot of people. If you were a left-winger, if you were Jewish, if you were a gypsy in Europe, things were getting much worse. And in 1936, things had spread. It wasn't just in Germany. A civil war had broken out in Spain. A Falangist regime had attempted to take power against the Spanish Republic, and the great slogan, which had become part of the East End myth about Cable Street, "They will not pass, non passeront," began to be heard around Europe.
Some anarchists now feel that their refusal to take power was the beginning of their undoing. At that time, the anarchists had no doubt about their main objective, to defeat fascism.
Whereas now, we find a political debate between people who appear to be identical. In Europe in the 1930s, we had world-opposing visions about how to organise society. We had the idea that ordinary people could take control of society, and we had the other idea, the idea which is behind the fascist model, which is that ordinary people should have no place in organising themselves, and that in fact capitalism would revert to the most barbaric forms in order to keep its control. People said contest means that we must retreat to order. So That was the basis of fascism in Europe. If you can't organise society around the needs of the people who run it, the capitalist class, the feudal landowners, then we need a hard fist. That's the basis of European fascism. And it appeals to the people who are disorganised by change. So the classical base is the petty bourgeoisie. And this doesn't happen in Britain because there isn't a big petty bourgeoisie. Britain had industrialised much earlier. Society was much more around the basis of people who lived with each other. They organised with each other. They didn't have problems in terms of deciding that they were being disorganised by themselves, the working class, or by the bosses they didn't like. And I think that's a very important point to remember about why fascism took place in Europe and why not in Britain. Britain is a historically successful capitalist country. For 200 years, Britain had worked. Capitalism was fine. People objected to it, and there are many struggles in this area which testify to how brutal it could be. But compare that with the experience of capitalist development in Germany or Eastern Europe, or in fact anywhere else in the world, and you understand how fragile that social relationship could be. What I mean by the fragility of capitalism in Europe is that it's a relatively new phenomenon. If you look at most European societies, and up until the 1890s, they're not very modern. They contain lots of social formations, social classes, who we wouldn't recognise. One of the interesting paradoxes about this is that getting rid of their Jewish population, in terms of the ghettos, in terms of the pogroms, gave us the Jewish population in the East End of London, which became much more radical and progressive. And that's good. And let's think about that when we think about people arriving here today. The problem for everybody considering the issue in Britain in 1936 was, well, how fragile is the regime in Britain? The Great Depression had happened, the First World War had been fought to end all wars and had produced what for the vast majority of ordinary people? So there was a potential for social disruption on a scale in British society that hadn't been seen since the 17th century. And that was what worried many, many people. It wasn't on the same scale, and I would never claim it was on the same scale as in most other areas of Europe. But many important people thought that the model for European political organisations could be transposed into Britain. And that was the point of Mosley.
I am speaking to you on behalf of a new political party. We'll fight in the next House of Commons to get a policy of vigour and of action.
That was the point about his new organisation. The new party had become the British Union of Fascists. The salvation of Britain, this entity, was to be through the fascist model. And he took one lesson, which he thought he could learn, from the experience of Central European fascism, which was anti-Semitism. And that's why the East End of London became the focus of his activity. It was the centre of the Jewish population. The majority of people in Stepney were Jewish. There were 60,000 people, not a lot, but it was still a majority population. They were the most vibrant elements of that population. They were not the only, but the most political elements of that population. They were foreigners. They were other. They were not British or English, whatever that meant in a mongrel nation, but there was something that could be identified as something that needed to be cleansed. An element of East London politics which had actually been taken place since 1905, since the Aliens Act, in which right-wing organisations had targeted the foreigner and the Jew. So Mosley came to the East End of London in October 1936 in order to make that point, in order to, in the narrow sense, to galvanise his own popular base, but also to key in to the wider debates and terrifying political discussions which were happening throughout Europe. And the reason, again, that he was interested in the East End was not only the other, but the people who lived around the East End. The small people, the costermongers, the lumpenproletariat, the people who dispossessed. The classical social base of fascism, he thought he could galvanise in places like Bethnal Green, the edge of the Jewish area.
You go to bed one night, you wake up in the morning, and you find the great champions of yesterday side by side on the same front bench, arms round each other's necks, dear old pals in the same national government.
We know to this day that the difficulty about areas of major immigration are not the areas at the centre. People get used to it. People are much more fearful on the edge. And Mosley appealed to that area on the edge of the Jewish community around Bethnal Green. And that's where his source of power was, except he never built it up. Because much more effective in going out to win the support of those people was the organisations of the East End. So he never made it. He was going to lose. And in that sense, Cable Street is less a monument, it's less the culminating battle, it's just a symbol. He couldn't win. He couldn't win because people were willing to take him on, but it wasn't the be-all and end-all of the struggle. The real battle was fought over the hearts and minds about who you identify with. Do you identify with the idea that other people from different countries were your enemy, or do you identify with the idea that something else was your enemy? That was never satisfied. That was never fully concluded. It wasn't as though people said, everybody's my brother and sister, but at least at Cable Street they decided that the solution of treating people as aliens was not a victory. The sensible thing about Mosley's strategy was, of course, that the Jewish population of the East End of London were a problem. They were Bolshevik bastards, and they were disproportionately radical. This is a very interesting phenomenon. It's not specific to the Jewish population, is that you often find that immigrant populations in dynamic cities, people who move around a lot, like merchant seamen, are disproportionately radical. And this is because they have more experiences. They live in society, not in isolated communities. And that was one of the great phenomena of East End Jewish life from the 1890s through the 1930s. So when Mosley and his fascists would say the Jews are communists, many Jews in East London would say, damn right, we're communists, we're radicals, we want to change the world. And that had a powerful influence. There were 60,000 Jewish people in the small borough of Stepney, and that was well over 50% of the population. But they had a disproportionate influence not only on the immediate area, but throughout the whole of the East End, where they galvanised the politics of the Irish workers in the Docklands, and they also had a big impact on the whole of the London Communist Party. And I think we need to remember that huge radical moment in which people who'd left the pogroms and the ghettos of the 1890s in Russia and Latvia and Poland arrived in a society which they thought was going to make them, but they had to remake themselves. That's a good thing. And they had to take on the British establishment. They had to take on an anti-Semitic British establishment. Mosley was a member of that establishment, and he thought it was entirely uncontentious to be anti-Semitic. And if you read any of the documents of the Conservative Party, whether it's from Churchill through to Baldwin, or even to the Daily Mail and the Daily Express, the Rothermere Press, entirely anti-Semitic. So Mosley thought he was on a winner, and he was on a winner. Nobody would have opposed him inside that political environment. But when he came to the East End, he found not only a Jewish working class willing to oppose him, but he found a political environment in which deciding people's worth on the basis of their ethnicity or their religion was not acceptable, but deciding what people's worth on the basis of their politics was.
And the Docklands soon came the fascist spring.
Nobody thought of doing a mural in 1936. And in one sense that's very unusual, because the 1920s and 1930s were the high point of political murals. And that's probably because of the nature of class struggle. Popular movements demanded not only political but cultural and aesthetic responses. And the great murals of the Mexican tradition, the South American tradition, which this mural in fact copies in positive homage were those in which active political struggle needed to find many forms of expression, not just in mural terms, but in Picasso's Guernica, in German Expressionism, which you also find particularly in the sort of little Hitler figure over here. He could come out of a George Grosz cartoon. This image of mass activity is very much derived from the political traditions, the cultural traditions of aesthetic modernity. But it didn't happen in the 1930s. There isn't that tradition in the British aesthetic or cultural environment. And the story, I think, is quite interesting. I think the most positive element of it is that the original artist, Dave Binnington, wanted to do something which reinvigorated an active political tradition. And he did that, I think, with every positive intention. And I think it's important to recognise that he did it in the context of a new political struggle in the mid-1970s. 1976 was a period in which a new problem had arisen in the East End, one in which the new immigrant population, predominantly Bangladeshi, faced a struggle against racism and a very weak form of fascism in terms of the National Front. And it's worth also making the point that, again, there was a three-way relationship here. That there was a problem from the fascists. They were physically intimidating. They did cause heartache. They did cause pain. They did cause suffering to the population of Brick Lane and the areas which had replaced the Jewish population. But much more significantly, the problem for the Bangladeshi population was the racism of the British state. It was the racism of immigration controls. It was the legitimation of differential treatment in housing policy of the Labour Party. It was the move of the Liberal Democrats to take advantage of discriminatory housing to get a foothold in the area. It's a whole new ball game of political politicking in the East End, of which the Bangladeshi population was at the centre and increasingly became a key component of the Labour Party and Liberal Party democratic machines. So Dave Binnington wanted to make a symbol, and he came into a minefield. He appropriates the aesthetics of the past and produces, a wonderful piece of public art. I bow to him, I take my hat off to him, but it becomes part of a struggle which has very little to do with the 1930s and everything to do with the machine politics of the 1970s and 1980s. And so, a handful of fascists can continually deface it. It isn't really finished till 1993 when they put a coat of varnish off. The council wants to wash its hands of it because it costs it a few thousand quid. Very few people take an interest in it because it's part of not of a living, vibrant political tradition, but of a cultural heritage of a population which no longer lives here. And it will be very difficult to reinvigorate that. In fact, you could never reinvigorate it by constantly talking about Cable Street. You could only reinvigorate it by talking about the rights of the Bangladeshi population to good housing and opposition to the government's asylum and immigration policy. And if you wanted to do that, and let's hope we do, only then could you make the Battle of Cable Street a living memory for the population of this area.